Tar Baby, Cassette 7.
Chapter 7. The black girls in New York City were crying, and their men were looking neither to the right nor to the left, not because they were heedless or intent on what was before them, but they didn't wish to see the crying girls split into two parts by their tight jeans, screaming at the top of their high heels, straining against the pull of their braids and the fluorescent combs holding their hair. Oh, their mouths were heavy with plum lipstick, and their eyebrows were a thin, gay line, but nothing could stop their crying, and nothing could persuade their men to look to the right or look to the left. They stoked their cocks into bikini underwear and opened their shirts to their tits. But they walked on tippy-toe through the streets looking straight ahead, and Son looked in vain for children. He couldn't find them anywhere. There were short people, and people under 12 years of age, but they had no child's vulnerability, no unstuck laughter. They cracked into the M2 bus like terrified bison running for their lives, for fear the school at their backs would grab them and eat them up one more time. It wasn't until he caught the downtown A that he saw what they had done with their childhood. They had wrapped it in dark cloth, sneaked it underground, and thrown it all over the trains. Like blazing jewels, the subway cars burst from the tunnels to the platforms shining with the recognizable artifacts of childhood, fantasy, magic, ego, energy, humor, and paint. They had taken it all underground. Pax and Stay High, and the 3 Yard Boys, Teen, P. Comet, and Popeye. He sat on a bench at 59th Street Station watching the childhood flash by. Now, all he needed to know was, where were the old people? Where were the Thereses and Gideons of New York? They were not on the subways, and they were not in the street. Perhaps they were all in kennels. That must be the reason the men walked that way, on tippy-toe, looking neither to the right nor to the left. The old people were in kennels, and childhood was underground. But why were all the black girls crying on buses, in red apple lines, at traffic lights, and behind the counters of Chemical Bank? Crying from a grief so stark you would have thought they'd been condemned to death by starvation in the lobby of Alice Tully Hall. Death by starvation in Mikkel's. Death by starvation on the campus of CUNY. And death by starvation at the reception desks of large corporations. It depressed him, all that crying, for it was silent and veiled by plum lipstick and the thin gay lines over their eyes. Who did this to you? Who has done this thing to you? He wondered as he walked down Columbus Avenue, looking first to the right and then to the left. The street was choked with beautiful males who had found the whole business of being black and men at the same time too difficult, so they dumped it. They had snipped off their testicles and pasted them on their chests. They put the weighty wigs Alma Este dreamed of on their heads and feathery eyelashes on their eyes. They flung sharp hips away to the right and away to the left and smiled sweetly at the crying girls and the men on tippy-toe. Only the Hilton whores seemed to him quiet and feeling no pain. He had tried a little television that first day, but the black people in whiteface playing black people in blackface unnerved him. Even their skin had changed through the marvel of color TV. A gray patina covered them all, and they were happy, really happy. Even without looking at their gray, no-color faces, the sound of their televised laughter was enough to tell him so. Different laughter from what he remembered it to be, without irony or defiance or genuine amusement. Now all he heard were shrieks of satisfaction. It made him shiver. How long had he been gone, anyway? If those were the black folks he was carrying around in his heart all those years, who on earth was he? The trouble he'd had the night he checked in was representative of how estranged he felt from these new people. The Hickey Freeman suit passed muster easily enough. and he wadded Jaden's $400 in his fist as he approached the desk. The clerk was about to give him a very hard time because, no, he would not be paying with a credit card, and no check either. Cash. 2 nights, cash. Son had chosen the line to wait in because the clerk's little pecan pie face looked friendly. Now he realized the boy was in love with his identification badge. Son was surprised at himself. He seldom misjudged people. He thought the love thing with Jaden must have thrown his sensibilities off, derailed his judgment, so he leaned toward the clerk and whispered, "Brother, do you want to get home tonight? This ain't your fucking hotel." But now he thought it was less an error in judgment than it was being confronted with a whole new race of people he was once familiar with. He was heart-weary when he opened the door to his room, and the purple carpet fairly took his breath away. He wanted her in that room with him, giving him the balance he was losing, the ballast and counterweight to the stone of sorrow New York City had given him. Jaden would lighten up the purple carpet, soften the tooth-white walls. She'd read the room service menu as though it were a private message to them both, and then choose a corner of the room to make love in. They had spent 2 whole days following the Christmas dinner in or near each other's arms, and the demoralized house never noticed. But they both understood that Son had to get out fast, so he used Jaden's ticket and Gideon's passport, and split. She was to follow as soon as she could get a flight, and had seen what Undine's and Sidney's situation was, whether they would stay or leave. He sat down in a plastic tub chair, rested his arms on the windowsill, and looked down at 53rd Street. How hard this one night's wait would be, shot full already of fallen airplanes and missed connections. Even if he managed to sleep from 6:30 p.m. to 6:30 a.m., what would he do with the morning? Refused to have breakfast until 9. Shave long and shower longer till noon, when Air France would glide like a crane into Kennedy. Did she say baggage claim or lobby? Or did she say to wait at the hotel? His mouth went suddenly dry with the possibility of losing her in that city. Was he in the right hotel? Was it the New York Hilton or the Statler Hilton? She just said Hilton. There was no way to call and find out without letting Sidney know. He might answer the phone himself, or Undine might, and if they knew she was joining him, they both might try to stop her. He could call Gideon. He tried to remember that hillside hut, but all he could summon were the powder-pink walls and the record player sitting on a shelf. Gideon had no phone, but messages got to him via a store halfway down that hill that sold rum and meat pies and lent out hair clippers. That was foolish. What could Gideon tell him anyway? He was so angry at the Americans, he was actually helping Therese prepare all sorts of potions and incantations for their destruction, just in case there was such a thing as magic after all. And he was quite willing to lend his passport to the man who shared his anger at the Americans. He couldn't understand why Son wanted to return to the country, too terrible for dying. But he agreed that one black face would look like another, and a difference of 20 years would not be noticed in a black man's 5-year-old passport. Therese gave Son, as a going-away present, a tiny, dirty bag of good fortune, but he tossed it away. It looked like ganja, and he didn't want to draw any attention to himself at customs. He took what Jaden gave him and left. Now, on the second day of their separation, he would just have to wait and keep on imagining disaster, since his emotions were so young that this heavy, grown-up love made him feel fresh-born, unprecedented, surrounded by an extended present loaded with harm. There was nothing to do. He would have to trust to her city sense to do the right thing and be in the right places. And this time tomorrow, he could smooth back her hair and sweep her eyebrows with his thumb. This time tomorrow, the side teeth in her smile would divert him from what she was saying or laughing at. He loved to watch her eyes when she was not watching his, and to listen to the 4/4 time of her heels. Son sat there, wagging his knees back and forth like a schoolboy, not thinking most of the important things that were to think about. What would they do? Where would they go, live? How would he earn enough to take care of her, and later their children? He smiled at the vigor of his own heartbeat at the thought of her having his baby. Watch her. He would watch her stomach while she slept, just the way he had when he had lived like an animal around the house and spent the hind part of the night at her bedside, pressing his dreams into hers. Now those dreams embarrassed him, the mewings of an adolescent brutalized by loneliness for a world he thought he would never see again. There was a future, a reason for hauling ass in the morning. No more moment-to-moment play-it-as-it-comes existence. That stomach required planning. Thinking through a move long before it was made. What would he name his son? Son of Sun? He should have thought about that before he left. Perhaps he would have taken things. Cash, jewelry, and the passport of a stranger instead of a friend. Instead, he took the clothes, one piece of luggage, and the ballet shoes and his bottle of Paco Rabanne. He saw it all as a rescue, first tearing her mind away from that blinding awe, then the physical escape from the plantation, his first, hers to follow 2 days later, unless... He remembered sitting at the foot of the table, gobbling the food, watching her pour his wine, listening to her take his part, trying to calm Undine and Sidney to his satisfaction, just as she had done the first night when they found him in the closet. He wouldn't look at her then, refused to lock with those mink dark eyes that looked at him with more distaste than Valerian's had. The mocking voice, the superior managerial, administrative, clerk in a fucking loan office tone she took. Gatekeeper, advance bitch, house bitch, welfare office torpedo, corporate cunt, tar baby side of the road whore trap, who called a black man old enough to be her father yard man, and who couldn't give a shit who he himself was, and only wanted his name to file away in her restrung brain, so she could remember it when the cops came to fill out the report. 5'11", maybe 6 feet, black as coal with the breath and table manners of a rhino. But underneath her efficiency and know-it-all sass were wind chimes. 9 rectangles of crystal, rainbowed in the light. Fragile pieces of glass tinkling as long as the breeze was gentle. But in more vigorous weather, the thread that held it together would snap. So it would be his duty to keep the climate mild for her, to hold back with his hands if need be thunder, drought, and all manner of winter kill. And he would blow with his own lips, a gentle enough breeze for her to tinkle in. The bird-like defenselessness he had loved when she slept and saw when she took his hand on the stairs was his to protect. He would have to be alert, feed her with his mouth if he had to, construct a world of steel and down for her to flourish in. For the love thing was already there. He had been looking for her all his life, even when he thought he had found her. In other ports, in other places, he shied away. He stood in her bedroom, a towel wrapped around his waist, clean as a whistle, having just said the nastiest thing he could think of to her, staring at a heart-red tree, desperately in love with a woman he could not risk loving because he could not afford to lose her. For if he loved and lost this woman, whose sleeping face was a limit his eyes could safely behold, and whose wakened face threw him into confusion, he would surely lose the world. So he made himself disgusting to her, insulted and offended her, gave her sufficient cause to help him keep his love in chains, and hoped to God the lock would hold. It snapped like a string. He stood up, searching for the anger that had shaken him so that first time and again on Christmas Day. But here, in this island of crying girls and men on tippy-toe, he couldn't find it. Even conjuring up that head of a coin profile, the unfleshed skin and evening eyes was not a vivid enough memory to produce it. He needed the blood-clot heads of the bougainvillea, the simple green rage of the avocado, the fruit of the banana trees puffed up and stiff like the fingers of gouty kings. Here, Pre-stressed concrete and steel contained anger, folded it back on itself to become a craving for things rather than vengeance. Still, he thought of it not just as love, but as rescue. He took off his clothes and filled the tub, smiling to think of what the leaden waves of the Atlantic had become in the hands of civilization. The triumph of ingenuity that had transferred the bored treachery of the sea into a playful gush of water that did exactly what it was told. And why not? Wilderness wasn't wild anymore or threatening. Wildlife needed human protection to exist at all. Stretched out in the water, his eyes closed, he thought of this city that he should have remembered. Where were the wavy 7 language on the windows of the butcher shops? The laundries named Hand? What had they done to the Apollo? Where was Michaud's? The awnings on St. Nicholas Avenue? Who were these people on the islands in the middle of Broadway? And where were the trees? There used to be trees coming out of concrete. But nobody could chop down a tree in New York, so he guessed he must have been wrong. That must have been some other city he had been memorizing. Jaden sat in the taxi, barely able to see over her luggage piled in the seat in front of her. Unlike the anxiety-ridden man in the Hilton bathtub, she wanted to giggle. New York made her feel like giggling. She was so happy to be back in the arms of that barfly with the busted teeth and armpit breath. New York oiled her joints, and she moved as though they were oiled. Her legs were longer here. Her neck really connected her body to her head. After 2 months of stingless bees, butterflies, and avocado trees, the smart, thin trees on 53rd Street refreshed her. They were to scale, human-sized, and the buildings didn't threaten her like the hills of the island had, for these were full of people whose joints were oiled just like hers. This is home, she thought, with an orphan's delight. Not Paris, not Baltimore, not Philadelphia. This is home. The city had gone on to something more interesting to it than the black people who had fascinated it a decade ago. But if ever there was a black woman's town, New York was it. No, not over there making land use decisions or deciding what was or was not information, but there, and there. Snapping whips behind the tellers' windows, kissing ass at Con Edison offices, barking orders in the record companies, hospitals, public schools. They refused loans at household finance, withheld unemployment checks and driver's licenses, issued parking tickets and summonses, gave enemas, blood transfusions, and please, lady, don't make me mad. They jacked up meetings in boardrooms, turned out luncheons, energized parties, redefined fashion, tipped scales, removed lids, cracked covers, and turned an entire telephone company into such a diamond head of hostility the company paid you for not talking to their operators. The manifesto was simple. Talk shit, take none. Jaden remembered and loved it all. This would be her city, too, her place. The place she spent a whole summer once in love with Ohm. Riding the subways looking for his name, first as a talisman, then as a friend, and finally as a lover in the tunnels of New York City. And now she would take it and give it to Son. They would make it theirs. She would show it, reveal it to him, live it with him. They would fall out of Max's Kansas City at 4 a.m. They would promenade 3rd Avenue from the 50s to Soho. They would fight landlords and drink coffee in the Village, eat bean pie on 135th Street, paella on 81st Street. They would laugh in the sex boutiques, eat yogurt on the steps of the 42nd Street Library, listen to RVR and BLS, buy mugs in Azuma's, chocolate chip cookies in Grand Central Station, drink margaritas at Suggs, and shop Spanish and West Indian at the Park Avenue Market. She would look up Dawn and Betty and Aisha and show him off. Her fine frame, her stag, her man. Jaden was so ruddish by the time she got to the Hilton, she could barely stand still for the doorman to take her bags. And when she checked in and had gotten his room number from information, she didn't call him. She took the elevator to his floor and banged on the door. When he opened it, she jumped on him with her legs around his waist, crashing him into the purple carpet. but he insisted on Elo. In spite of the gate and Central Park in the snow, they moved into Dawn's apartment, available to them for 4 months while she was on the coast shooting her 7th pilot, the one that was sure to stick. 4 months in that apartment of long and bristling winter days when he slowed her down to the speed of a tulip. Murky New York days when she spun him like a top until he slammed into the headboard. He met her women friends, girls who talked with their shoulders and found them less than she. He met her men friends, alight with success, almost rich, and found them less than he. Everybody was ridiculous, maimed or unhappy to them, so satisfied were they with their mutual adoration. He thought he would have to stamp the ground, paw it, and butt horns with every male they came in contact with, but he didn't. Her devotion surprised him. She looked only at him, and grew her own horns when other men got out of line. She was startled and pleased to discover that his beauty, so sudden and impressive on Ile des Chevaliers, was volcanic in the city. As if waitresses and the eyes of passers-by had not already told her, her own friends altered as well in his presence. Dawn went completely Annie Rooney, falling all over herself with helplessness and generosity. Betty, who had been into bisexuality for 6 months, couldn't get back into the closet fast enough when Son was in the room. And when Jaden told Son about Betty's range of interests, she was angry enough to fight. Still, he insisted on Elo. Even after she earned $2,500 for 4 walks and a picture spread all in 2 weeks, and they bought each other pretty things. Even after he worked the bar 3 afternoons at a fashion show where he got the drinks mixed up, dropped a 5th of gin, and Leonard, the old man who had taken him on as a favor to Jaden, shook his head in disbelief. Son took 6 bottles of leftover champagne, the $150, and gave it all to her. They got swinging drunk, and Jaden laughed in his ear and called him an unskilled sickle cell anemia motherfucker. They were sober, too, and he let her be still and cry after she told him about her mother and the awful hat she'd worn to the funeral, too big and grown up for a little girl of 12. She poured her heart out to him, and he to her, dumb things, secret things, sin and heroism. They told each other all of it, or all they could. He told her what she wished to hear about the war. He couldn't speak to her or anyone about it coherently, so he told her what she wished to hear. No, he never killed anybody with his hands. Yes, he was wounded, and he showed her a burn on his skin from a burst boiler to prove it. Yes, he had been afraid, although in truth he had not been, or had not been properly frightened. He had laughed, in fact, laughed all over Vietnam, because at 18 laughter was his only reliable weapon. It was still early in the war, but when trucks sank in mud and grenades exploded too soon or not at all, laughter was always there, almost always. But one day it ran out too, as unreliable as his fucked-up M14. The silence in his throat, where laughter or tears ought to be, blew up in his head, and he was stockaded, busted, and when he refused to re-up, discharged without honor or humor. He went to Elo, married Cheyenne, left the set early when a fist fight broke out, and found his sleeping wife, sleeping with a teenager. He was silent then, too, as he ran his car through the house and the bed caught on fire. He pulled them both out, the teenager and Cheyenne, but she didn't make it. He watched her wrappings, but not her eyes in the hospital, and still no sound. It was hearing about Frisco blowing up in a gas field. Oh, no good Frisco. He used to pay him to clean fish. That did it. His father told him the news when he met him at the bus stop across the state line with money. Told him to hurry, told him to write, and told him about Frisco. In a tiny toilet at the rear of the bus, Son cried like an infant for all the blowings up in Asia. Jaden kissed his hands, and he asked her why she left the States in the first place. She said she always thought she had 3 choices: marry a dope king or a doctor, model, or teach art at Jackson High. In Europe, she thought there might be a 4th choice. They told each other everything. Yet he insisted on Elo. She listened to him and nodded, thinking anywhere with him would be all right. She was completely happy. After all those sexually efficient men, all those foreplay experts and acrobats and nonverbal equipment men, his wildness and fumbling, his corny, unself-conscious joy was like blue sky water. Show me again what it's like to be shining all alone in the sky. And he did that. And he did more. Regarding her whole self as an ear, he whispered into every part of her stories of ice caps and singing fish, the fox and the stork, the monkey and the lion, the spider goes to market. And so mingled was their sex with adventure and fantasy that, to the end of her life, she never heard a reference to Little Red Riding Hood without a tremor. They thought about Ile des Chevaliers sometimes. He would say Ali Balin, and she would scream with laughter. She wrote 2 misleading postcards to Undine and Sidney, got a short, sorrowful, somewhat accusatory letter back, which she refused to let sour her happiness. Her leave-taking had been difficult. She was dependent at last on that mulatto with a leer sent by Dr. Michelin as the new yard boy. The streets seemed not to notice or mind her going. Only Undine and Sidney were cut up about it. She promised to send for them as soon as they wanted her to. But she had to take this gig, she told them. Then she left the 2 sullen and confused old people at the kitchen table, their hearts steeled against her leaving, even though her New York trip, she said, was vital if she were to arrange things so all 3 could live together. She couldn't let them know who waited at the Hilton. Son and Jaden discussed their situation in Dawn's apartment. Undine and Sidney seemed unsure of their jobs, but no steps had been taken to let them go, it seemed. Son was less than sympathetic to Undine's plight because she had acted too shuffle-footed, keeping her white lady's secret like it was hern, and loving her white lady's baby like it was hern, too. And much less sympathetic to Sidney, because in 30 years he had not split Valerian's skull. 80% of both Sidney's and Undine's conversation was the caprice and habits of their master. "You still like that old man, don't you?" Sidney asked her. "Who, Valerian?" "Yes." "He put me through school, I told you." "Nothing in return?" "No, nothing. Never made a pass, nothing." "And Margaret," he said, "how does she treat you?" "Okay, she was more distant than he was, but she was nice to me, nice enough anyway." "She wasn't very nice to your folks," he said. "Actually, she was," Jaden answered. "They both were. At least from what I could see of it. That's why I was so took out that day. I couldn't believe it. They fought like we did in grade school." "Wild," he said, thinking of rescue. "Really wild." Jaden let 2 of her fingers do the Charleston in the hair of his chest. "We'll get rich and send for them and live happily ever after," she said, and thought it was so, but not right this minute, not today. There was so much nestling to do. They had only 2 months left in the apartment, but they needed more time. Jaden habitually shaved herself all over like a 4th-grade Girl Scout, and he finally got around to telling her he wanted some body hair. But they needed time for it to grow, much more time. Time for her to sketch him right for once. But why sketch when she could touch? Time to make a genuine paella. Time for her to finish the macrame plant holder, for him to fix the dishwasher. They must have been in love. They never once turned on the television. They forgot to buy cigarettes or alcohol, and they didn't even jog in the park. There wasn't a permanent adult job in the whole of the city for him, so he did teenagers' work on occasion and pieces of a grown man's work. He spoke to the men at the shape-up halls. The black men told him Baltimore. Everyone works on the docks in Baltimore, or Galveston, or San Diego, or New Orleans, or Savannah. New York? Not a chance. There was a little pilfering money. That was about all. Some small-time truckers gave him brute work, lookout work, and sometimes he dropped payoffs when asked. But none of it could hold his attention. And one afternoon, while he was helping a trucker unload boxes on Broadway and 101st Street, he heard a commotion in the traffic. A young girl with a shaved head and a small ring in her nostril was cursing a man right in the middle of the street. The man, who looked African or West Indian to Son by the innocent confusion in his face, stood watching her in silence. 2 or 3 of his friends leaned on cars, looking elsewhere but obviously waiting for the finale. The girl was in jeans, platform shoes, and a thin sweater. She had the voice of a sergeant, and her language was nasty enough to be memorable. Cars honked at them before swerving into parallel lanes. Pedestrians glanced and then pretended they weren't there. Only Son and people in second-story windows gave them their undivided attention. It was beyond embarrassment. The girl's face was as tight and mean as broccoli. Her forefinger shot bullets into the pavement. But inside her narrow, angry eyes were many other eyes. Some of them hurt, some brave, some just lonely, hollow eyes. And her shaved head had reminded Son of his sister. He listened to the abuse, the catalog of shame and rage, until the man felt safe enough, his backup team still leaned on the cars, to turn his back on her and walk away. None of which dulled the glitter of her nose ring or shut her mouth. She word-whipped him on down the street and probably would have followed him to make it stick, except Son, made miserable by the eyes inside her eyes, went over and stood in front of her with his arms wide open. She looked at him with hatred older than lava. "Come here," he said. She didn't move, so he put his arms around her to shield her from the eyes of the second-story people and bank her fire. The girl bucked, but he wouldn't let her go. "You're going to freeze to death," he said. "Let me buy you a drink." She tipped her forehead into his chest then and began to cry. "Come on," he said. "There's a place down the block." Arm around her shoulder, he led the way to a Chinese restaurant and ordered her a gin. She drank and began to tell him about the man, but Son shook his head. "Don't," he said. "Don't think about it." "You got a place to stay?" She said, "Not tonight, I don't." So he left the job hauling boxes and took her home. All 3, Nomo, Jaden, and Son, went to a delicatessen where, after much discussion, they bought potato chips, A&W root beer, and 3 payday candy bars with Son's last $10 bill. They ate it all in the snow. Cold and giggling, they trudged back to the apartment where Son and Jaden slept like puppies, and Nomo made off with the change. Yet, he insisted on Elo. She agreed. But before they could make plans, she stubbed her big toe on a metal plate bolted to the middle of 6th Avenue. By the time she got home, her toe was the size of a plum and very painful. Son made a splint for it out of emery boards and the ribbon from a Valentine candy box. All night he woke at half-hour intervals to bathe her toe in an Epsom salt solution. In the morning, the swelling had decreased, and he left for work while she slept. When she woke and hobbled to the bathroom, she saw that he had drawn a happily obscene picture under the toilet lid. At his coffee break, he called. "How's your toe?" "Lonely?" "Mine, too. Come home for lunch. I only have 30 minutes for lunch, baby. Come anyway. I won't be able to get back in time. I'll lose a half-day's pay. I'll make it worth your while." He came home and didn't report to work again until she could walk effortlessly. In the meantime, they ate Chinese food in the tub. She read true confession stories to him with appropriate white girl voices and gestures, and he laughed until his chest hurt. She read Césaire to him, and he closed his eyes. She read the sexy parts of the Bible, and he looked at her. Gradually, she came to feel unorphaned. He cherished and safeguarded her. When she woke in the night from an uneasy dream, she had only to turn, and there was the stability of his shoulders and his limitless, eternal chest. No part of her was hidden from him. She wondered if she should hold back, keep something in store for him, but he opened the hair in her head with his fingers and dove his tongue through the part. There was nothing to forgive, nothing to win, and the future was 5 minutes away. He unorphaned her completely, gave her a brand-new childhood. They were the last lovers in New York City, the first in the world, so their passion was inefficient and kept no savings account. They spent it like Texans. When he had a sore throat so bad he couldn't speak, she put him to bed and drew a checkerboard on the inside of a Bergdorf box. They played the game with M&Ms. It didn't work because the crowns wouldn't stay still, so they used her Inovids instead, partly because of their plain surface, and partly to keep her from eating the pieces jumped by her kings. She told him straight brandy was good for his throat, and made him drink so much so fast he passed out. She didn't like his being unconscious without her, so she drank the rest and passed out with him. He woke first and vomited the strep away. After bathing and dressing, he watched her sleep. She woke unable to see, speak, or move, and he put his huge hand on her forehead until she could. They didn't go to parties anymore. Other people interfered with their view of each other. They stopped going to Suggs and across 110th Street. They stopped laughing and began to smile at each other. From across the room, across the mattress, across the table. Their language diminished to code at times, and at others ballooned to monologues delivered while cradled in each other's arms. They never looked at the sky or got up early to see a sunrise. They played no music and hadn't the foggiest notion that spring was on its way. Vaguely aware of such things when they were apart, together they could not concentrate on the given world. They reinvented it, remembered it through the other. He looked at her face in the mirror and was reminded of days at sea when water looked like sky. She surveyed his body and thought of oranges, playing jacks and casks of green wine. He was still life, babies, cut glass indigo, hand spears, dew, cadmium yellow, Hanse red, moss green, and the recollection of a tree that wanted to dance with her. It was difficult to be sober, to take anything other than themselves seriously, but they managed occasionally. She thought about calling her old professor, who said he could always find work for her. But maybe May would be a better time to ring him, after exams. They discussed opening a retail flower shop and boutique that they could call Jaden Son. They discussed bank robbery and an agency for black models. They discussed the New School and Empire State and figured out a way to collect Gideon's unemployment checks. But Jaden was not worried. She had $1,940 in the bank, $5,000 in Paris, and connections. If push came to shove, she'd go permanent with an agency and work her behind off. The check scheme worked, but he had time to pick up just one check before they left, hand in hand, for ELO.
This ends side 1 of cassette 7. Please turn the cassette over and start side 2 at the same point.